My name is Paul. I live in Singapore, but I'm an engineer and I work at Stripe. If you're not familiar with Stripe, Stripe is a payments infrastructure company. And today I want to talk to you about how we use React and GraphQL. So just a quick kind of disclaimer, like what we're going to talk about here. This talk isn't necessarily about what GraphQL is and why you should use it. It's more about how Stripe uses GraphQL and why we use it, why we think it's great. So I want to talk a bit more about the GraphQL and the modern product development stack, talk about some stuff that we built at Stripe with GraphQL, and just some unexpected cool benefits that we found out. But first, very important, everything I'm talking about here was developed by many people over many different teams. I can't take any credit for any of this. Yeah, it takes a bit to do this stuff. So in the screenshot here on the left, you see just a small part of the Stripe dashboard. Now, the Stripe dashboard is the main tool that we use, what our users use, to find out everything about their Stripe account. You can look at some logs here. You can find out about your API keys, make payments, etc. It's a really important tool and kind of the first thing that our users see. And we have a lot of teams working on this at the same time, so it really needs to work and gel together as much as possible. So here's our stack. Yes, we use Flow. Don't at me. But what I really want to talk about is the last part here, which is GraphQL and Apollo, which is kind of new for our stack. So Leonardo earlier already gave like a really good little run-through of GraphQL, but I'll make this really brief. So first of all, can I just get by show of hands? Obviously, everyone here has now heard of GraphQL, but who has actually used GraphQL here? OK, enough people for this to not be super obvious. Right, so on the left-hand side, you see we have a more traditional REST API. REST API is great, but GraphQL is an API technology. You know, it works in terms of a schema instead of defined endpoints. So everything you see on the left-hand side, and authors and posts, I instead have a schema displayed here on the right. So one of the big benefits of GraphQL, as I showed earlier, is that it prevents overfetching. Rather with a REST API where I don't know exactly what data I'm getting back, with GraphQL, I explicitly tell the backend what I want, and it gives me exactly what I want. And unlike having to have one URL, or sorry, instead of having multiple URLs for REST, I only have one /GraphQL endpoint, which is great. So how do we make product development better at scale? It's the at scale part here which I'm really interested in. The kind of traditional product development looks a bit like this, right? You have a front end, you have a back end, and you have an API which lets you talk to one another. This is what the ideal situation would look like, but in reality, it looks more like this. There's a lot going on here, especially like a modern JavaScript ecosystem. I even have two backends here, which is becoming more popular. How do you make sure all these parts communicate with one another? The most valuable systems are those that can tie into all these aspects of development. So for example, a UI component system. So what we've done at Stripe is we've kind of replaced these middle two bits with Apollo CodeGen and GraphQL API. And the best thing about this, that means that all these components here can now talk to one another using the same format and the same data, which in this case is GraphQL. So all these things know how to talk to each other, share the data. So why does GraphQL have such a big impact? Well, schema defines capabilities, queries define data requirements. From this schema here on the left, I can combine them two on the right, even get some little auto-completion, as you can see here. And I can reduce overfetching of data. I can have accurate monitoring. This is something I'll talk about a little bit later. And we have a really good mocking system. Here's a couple of more big impact stories with GraphQL. What I want to highlight here really is monitoring. In GraphQL, you can track usage for a specific field. This has traditionally been a very difficult thing to do in a REST API. You don't know what fields are actually being used when fetched from your backend. That's really hard to do. I'm going to talk about some of the other things in a sec. So first, let's take a look at some of the tools that we built at Stripe. First, data mocking. So why would you mock stuff? It seems like obvious why we'd mock, but it's really good to kind of take a step back and really think about it. So when you mock stuff, you have faster, more resilient tests. You don't have to wait on an API. You have immediate test results. You can avoid the waterfall flow by actually being able to develop your front-end components before the backend's even built when you mock stuff. And it's really easy to generate edge case states. So GraphQL makes mocking really easy. Because we have a schema, and the schema has types in it, we already know what shape our data is going to look like and exactly what type it's going to look like. So this is actually a code snippet I grabbed from the GraphQL tools. On the left, I have a schema string. And on the right, I'm mocking it with add mock functions to schema function. I have my query, and as a result, I have the data with just some generic data based on those types. But the problem here is, what about edge cases, right? If I have a globally mocked schema, which is what we're looking for, what about these little edge cases? Well, traditionally what you would do is you would have per request mocking. It means that for all my edge cases, I would have a request and a response, and I'll have the exact response here. This is nice, this is good, but now I lose all the benefits of my schema-based mocking. So what we do at Stripe is we try to have the best of both worlds, where we have overrides. This means that I have my generic data, which created from my schema, but I can override some things so I can test for a specific edge case. Over here, my custom resolvers is the function that we wrote, which actually lets me add extra data. This is just a simple to-do list. All I care for this particular to-do list is that there's 2 items, one that is completed and one that is not. Everything else has been mocked, which means that when I run my code and I test it, I know exactly what I'm testing for. So here's like an example of these default mocks. In this case, I have this connect overview page React component. This actually takes a lot of props and a lot of data. But in this test, I don't care about what kind of data goes in. I just care that it renders and that it doesn't break or anything. So with global mocking via GraphQL, I actually have a lot of props that are being passed into this component via Apollo Test Provider. And I can just very easily check, does this work or not? Here's an example of the same, except we're using overrides now. So I now have this custom resolver where I can add things like a currency, availability, pending, etc. And I can test for exactly that, what I'm interested in at the very bottom, without having to worry about all the other props that are put into this particular component. We also have some nice mocks for a really common edge case, which can be traditionally quite difficult to test, which is error states and loading states. So here I have an error provider and I have a loading provider, which keeps those components in a perpetual state of either loading or error. So you can very easily see what your users will see if something goes wrong. Next, I want to talk about schema validation. And this is something that's really important and very dear to us at Stripe, because we have grown into a larger company where we have many people working on the same thing. So when you make a small focused API change, I want to make sure that I don't break 100 other components scattered about our component base, our component system. Because it's really easy to do that because of the very nature of that component and a hereditary system. So we need guardrails to be able to do this. So what's really hard about the Stripe dashboard is that we do have a lot of people who work on the same project who don't necessarily see each other in person because we have globally distributed teams. So how do we coordinate all these people to build this thing, especially across multiple time zones? For that, we have a guardrail. So I'm going to talk about a little bit more about this in a sec, but generally we have a one schema.graphql file. We can generate flow types automatically, and we have a backwards compatibility checker. So first, all of our GraphQL, our whole schema, is in one file. It's checked into our monorepo. It's automatically generated by our API code. And everything that we need, this is the source of truth for all our data that goes from the back end to the front end. And what's cool about this is that, as you can see here, every single item here in this address has a type associated with that. What can we do with that? Well, with Apollo CodeGen tools, we can actually generate flow types on the fly automatically. Everything that comes from the schema now has an automatic types set to it, which makes developing a lot easier. This is really cool. So what we built at Stripe is something called Query Wrapper. This is a function which takes an owner, in this case the team that was responsible for this code, and it takes a query. This is just a normal GraphQL query, and it says exactly what data that I want for this component. And it gives me back a ready-to-use React component. Here it is in use. When I try to render it, I have some props, I have a loading state, I have an error state, and I have data. And this data object is just what I specified what I wanted in the previous GraphQL query. So this is a really nice and easy way to get my props and my components up running fast as possible. But we need a backwards compatibility checker. Why do we need this? Well, we found that at Stripe, sometimes people do not refresh their front end ever. In one instance, we had someone who took over a month before they refreshed their pages. And we want to make sure that even those people who do not like to close tabs, you know who you are, we want to make sure that they don't have a bad experience with if they try an operation and the front end gets back data it wasn't expecting, you get errors, not good. So we actually have built this into our CI component where if you change the schema in any way, it yells at you and says, don't do that. But then you say, okay, well, how do you actually make breaking changes then? Well, how do you actually add stuff to this? Well, sometimes if you don't want a field and you're verified no one's using, we can have a simple two-step process. We mark a field as deprecated, and we delete it, merge. Sorry, we mark a field as deprecated, then we merge, and then once we're sure that no one's using that field anymore, which we can do via monitoring with GraphQL, we can just delete it. This is not ideal for things like modifying an existing field, but we're working on things like that. Next, I want to talk about just the benefits we've seen from adopting GraphQL. So if you've ever read about GraphQL or if you've ever seen a video, you see like these common benefits, which we absolutely agree with. These are fantastic. Reduce overfetching, not having too many queries to worry about. These are all fantastic, but I want to talk more about what we at Stripe have really found has been really beneficial about using GraphQL at scale, which can be summed in great tools and community, easily add stuff, and those static types. First, I just want to talk about the tools and docs. So because GraphQL and Apollo CodeGen are open source communities, a lot of work goes into this stuff. As much as we love and are very proud of the internal tooling we have, every tool we build in-house is something that we have to maintain ourselves. By using GraphQL, there are many large companies that are using this. It kind of takes the strain off of us. And they're just fantastic documentation to be had with GraphQL as well. One of the best things about GraphQL is that if you have heard of GraphQL and have used it in a previous job, if you start work at Stripe, you already know how Stripe's front end works, because it's exactly the same way it was before. And finally, the real big benefit that we've seen is just the automatically generated static types. So this, we use Flow internally. However, this will work with TypeScript as well. It's just really nice to have a component with data and know exactly what types those data is. And it makes it really easy to review code, gives you less unintentional side effects, and you can modify components so much faster. So in conclusion, I promised this would be short because I know we're holding up lunch right now. GraphQL works across the stack at scale really nicely. It makes everyone happy. It lets all your developers kind of work in unison and touch the same code without stepping on each other's feet. It makes testing easier. And what's really nice is just how quickly people can ramp up and start developing with GraphQL. And I promise I was not paid by GraphQL to say these things. I genuinely do think it's a fantastic service. Right, with that, thank you so much for having me. Please do check out stripe.dev and come to our workshop, which is hopefully starting in about an hour's time.